All right, let's conclude by taking a look at Veitch and Spicer's other argument for a physician obligation to provide fetal care. And then we'll just sort of briefly sum up things to think further about, as well as putting this discussion into a more general context about death and dying. Okay, so in addition to the argument from offense, Veitch and Spicer also provide what they call from the argument from contract. And this argument says, first, only physicians are licensed to control the use of life-saving medical technology. That's just true. Part of becoming a physician includes accepting a public trust to use this monopoly control to preserve lives when appropriate decision makers want them preserved. Yeah, it certainly does. I mean, that's part of what being a physician is that you've been sort of given by the public a certain kind of control, and what we're sort of expecting and hoping you'll do is to use that technology to keep all of us alive when that's what we want. That's just sort of generally what we ask you to do with this monopoly control that physicians have over this technology. And they think it's rational, when we're creating a monopoly over life-saving technology, to adopt a policy that protects the minority view regarding the use of those technologies. And they're going to give us a thought experiment for that premise that we'll look at in just a minute. But first, I want to just think a little bit more about what they're suggesting here. So they're making an appeal to what sort of policy or rule actually makes sense. And they're also acknowledging that it is a minority position to want to be kept alive in these kinds of cases. And most people, and this is even more true today than it was when this was written, I think would not opt for the kind of ventilator support that Helga Wangley received. I don't think most of us want to be alive in a persistent vegetative state for like 7 months or anything like that. I personally tend to feel that way about some of the cases in the film Facing Death as well, that I don't think that I would want to pursue sort of multiple bone marrow transplants or blood to, treat blood cancer or something like that. I think there is a point well before what those folks are willing to go through to stay alive, where I would probably just call it quits. And I imagine some of you have that view and others don't, and maybe some of you haven't thought about that very much. But what is interesting about what Veitch and Spicer want to do here is suggest that, look, in these kinds of cases where we're giving people this monopoly control over this technology, what we should do is protect the view of people who might want it in these extreme cases. And here's what is called a thought experiment for that premise. They say, look, imagine a society that's considering creating a monopoly over life-saving technology. There are going to be cases in that society where the majority see no value in using it, but the minority desperately want it. Roughly, this is the society we have now. But suppose that you don't actually know, when you're sort of thinking about this society, what position you will be in, whether you will be in the majority or the minority. So sort of pretend you're not yourself and you actually have a view about it. Suppose that you don't yet. You don't know where you're going to fit in this sort of hypothetical society. What it would make most sense for you to do in that case where you don't know what side of the fence you're going to be on, what you'll want to do is prefer a policy that protects that minority position, because that's going to give both groups what they want. And since you don't know what you would prefer, or what position you're going to be in, the majority position or the minority position, what you want are policies that protect the chance that you're going to be in that minority, and because we don't want to be sort of in a position where we're being sort of oppressed by this majority position, should we be among people who want this kind of life-saving technology. So that's kind of the experiment, and that's sort of rooted in this mechanism that actually was sort of first identified by a philosopher named John Rawls, what he described as the veil of ignorance, this idea that when you're thinking about what policies and sort of rules for constructing a society make the most sense, what you should do is sort of extract yourself away from your own point of view and think about what sort of policies you would want if you didn't know where you fit in that position. So, for example, we already know that people that are wealthier tend to favor policies that don't involve a lot of taxation, that allow them to keep a lot of their wealth, and that sort of thing. Not across the board, but in many cases there's this sort of statistical correlation. And among people that maybe utilize social services or have done so in the past, we tend to see much more enthusiasm for those services. So the thought is that people tend to support policies that reflect what is sort of best for them. And that's not selfish. It's just what makes sense. It's just what sort of makes sense for people to do. It's sort of a reasonable thing to prefer policies that help you out and to see those policies as the best ones. And Rawls's thought was, look, when you sort of extract and take away those facts about yourself and just think about like what would make the most sense if you didn't know who you were going to be, rich or poor, male or female, particular race, particular educational, economic background. That's going to tell you what policies really make the most sense. It's going to be the ones that make sense from this sort of ignorant point of view, behind this veil of ignorance, as he put it. And that's really what Veitch and Spicer are doing here. They're just saying, look, imagine you didn't know whether you were going to be someone who wanted life-saving technology to be used in these sort of extreme cases or not. What policy would make the most sense if you didn't know what side of the fence you were going to sit on in that debate? And they say, look, it's the one that protects the minority view, because if you ended up being in that position, you would really, really want to be able to access it. Whereas if you ended up being in the majority, it would not be as sort of bad for you if that minority view was the one that was protected. And let's keep in mind that this is limited, right? Veitch and Spicer don't think that there's a general obligation to provide medically fetal care. They think this is limited to, as we saw, cases where the treatment in question is life-prolonging and not sort of harmful or a burden to the patient. But they also think that there's got to be an ongoing physician-patient relationship. This can't be something that people sort of walk in the door and ask for. And that's rarely what these futility cases are like anyway. It's also got to be cases where no colleague is capable of and willing to take the case. That's an effort to sort of allow physicians a certain amount of autonomy and opting out of these sorts of things if they want to. And of course the clinician is competent, the care is predictably life-prolonging, and then they introduce this notion of equitable funding. They say, look, this is going to be limited to cases of equitable funding. This is kind of reflecting a concern that Miles had about the Helga Wangley case. They say, look, medically fetal care is obligatory only in cases where it's either being paid for by the patient out of pocket or by an insurance group where it's explicit that this kind of care is going to be covered, right? Because then the thought is, look, the only people who are going to be paying for this kind of care via insurance premiums are people who would want it for themselves. So we don't have the kind of worries we have about Helga Wangley, where her insurance was sort of covering care that other members of the insurance group had not sort of opted into providing. So that's what's going to eliminate Helga Wangley ultimately as a case where fetal treatment was obligatory. It's not anything about the futility considerations. It's just the money. It's the equitable funding. Excuse me, I sneezed. Okay, let's just sum up. I think just a couple of points that we can take away from this, because we're obviously not going to resolve this. What we've got are sort of competing arguments. Although the view that we get is that medically fetal care is either obligatory only in these extreme sorts of cases, or it's just not obligatory, and perhaps more strongly, it's obligatory not to provide it. We don't get anyone saying, look, it's obligatory all the time. That's a kind of, I think that's kind of a naive view of patient autonomy, although there may be, people talk that way, even though they don't actually think that patients are entitled to whatever care they ask for. But I think what we can see here is some general agreement that cases of medical futility are within the purview of physicians. So when we're talking about treatment that is not going to be physiologically effective, or that's not going to prolong their life in any relevant way whatsoever, then there seems to be a widespread agreement that those are cases where physicians can just legitimately and straightforwardly say no and refuse, and they're not sort of violating any kind of obligation. There's no obligation to give treatment that's futile in this medical sense. But cases of normative futility, where what we're talking about is like life-prolonging care that's seen as not worthwhile in some way, those are more controversial cases. Cases like Helga Langley are really the tough cases, because those are cases where there is something that could be described as a medical benefit, but there's still a sense in which the treatment is not worth it, because it's not going to sort of bring about an end to the patient's underlying condition. And I think we can also see an ongoing debate about whether, and if so to what extent, medicine is value-free, whether that's the right way to think about it. And there's also an ongoing debate about which duties a physician actually has ought to take precedent here, whether there's kind of a neat balancing act taking place between duties of beneficence, which seem to tell against fetal care, and duties of respect for autonomy that seem to sort of support providing fetal care when it's asked for and when it's demanded. And with Veitch and Spicer, but others as well, we see that it may really depend on facts about particular cases. Okay, and again, let's just conclude here by, in addition to summing up some of these general points, putting this issue back into a context that relates to this general theme of death and dying that we're talking about. We saw earlier that it was important for physicians to know when a patient is dead, in part because they need to know what their obligations are in a particular case. I think this becomes more complicated when a patient is not dead, but they are actively dying, in the sense that medical futility cases are usually concerned with. I mean, on the one hand, dying patients aren't dead, so that seems to imply that physicians have all the same obligations to them. But on the other hand, medically fetal care seems problematic for a variety of reasons that we've gotten into here, including its cost, the burdens it imposes, and the fact that it seems to be in certain ways contrary to the aims of medicine. And what I think we should notice is that this question about whether or not to provide potential, especially if we're talking about life-prolonging care, that question never comes up in cases where we're not dealing with someone who is actively dying in this way. So as much as we want to say, and our intuitions say, no, the obligations are the same for a living person as a sort of dying person. As long as they're not dead, the physician has the same obligations. But you might wonder if that's really the case, because in these futility cases, we're talking about people who are actively dying, and we're asking whether we have those same obligations. So you might think that one's status as dying affects the obligations that physicians have to you. So the question can kind of be put this way: do our obligations to others lessen when those people are dying, or are they just outweighed by other sorts of factors? There are a couple different ways we can think about this and try to flesh it out. But the point is just that cases where people are dying seem to be the only cases where these kinds of questions actually come up. And then the other issue that we should continue to think about, and that we've only just sort of scratched at, is this matter of social obligations. Because we don't currently acknowledge an obligation to provide everyone with all the medical care they might need, but we do view life-saving and emergency care as obligatory, irrespective of ability to pay. If you walk into an emergency room and you need life-sustaining care, the staff in that hospital are obligated to give it to you. It doesn't matter if you can pay for it or not. And in cases of fetal care, we seem to abandon that view, right? We no longer seem to be saying, oh yeah, physicians are obligated. Now we're asking real questions about whether they're obligated. And we're asking real questions about whether things like Medicare ought to pay for them, and things like regular insurance ought to pay for them. I mean, nobody asks you whether you're, when you're signing up for your medical insurance, there's never a question asked about whether you're okay with paying for emergency care for people who can't afford it. That's all sort of built into the costs of medicine, and including medical insurance. And yet in this case, it seems, and there's a pretty big consensus, that our obligation doesn't extend to these futility cases, even the futility cases where the treatment is life-prolonging. And you might think that's really surprising. So again, the thought is that one's status as dying reduces obligations that we otherwise recognize. And if that move is justified, we need to know on what grounds it's justified. What is it about the fact that a person is dying that justifies not extending to them the same kinds of entitlements that we extend to people who are not actively dying? Okay, the question is going to be about the argument from contract, and then you can move on to the discussion board and the module assignments. Keep in mind, again, access via Canvas is going to disappear once you submit the lecture assignments. Just keep that in mind. Again, you can access this stuff on YouTube by searching my name, going to my channel, and finding everything there. So if you need to revisit stuff for the assignment, that's perfectly fine to do, but your access via Canvas is going to be eliminated.